Days of Future Past, my all-time favorite X-Men film, and that's even over Logan. Now, before you go ahead and unsubscribe, let me explain why. When Days of Future Past was made, it was supposed to fill in gaps in the timeline and fix many continuity errors created by previous films. Once Days of Future Past was added to the film's timeline, a synopsis of each film in order makes a clearer picture of the overall story. For this video, I'll be cutting Days of Future Past into 4 separate time periods. Days of Past, the original past that they have to go back and change. Days of Future, which is the dark future at the beginning of the movie. Days of Future Past, the main plot of the story. And the new future, where Logan wakes up and everything's fixed. In X-Men First Class, the CIA discovers a mutant group called the Hellfire Club and recruits Xavier's mutants to fight them. This is the founding of the X-Men and the Brotherhood by the end of the film, and the military discovers mutants exist. They have allies, Moira McTaggart, and enemies, Agent Stryker. Also, Wolverine makes a cameo. In Days of Past, this is the period of the downfall of the Brotherhood and the dissolving of the X-Men, as Agent Stryker's son, William, works alongside Trask Industries to hunt and study mutants. Xavier and Beast are hiding while Mystique kills Trask and is captured by Stryker to make Sentinels using her DNA. Meanwhile, Wolverine works for the mob. X-Men Origins, Wolverine and his brother Sabretooth meet Stryker while fighting in the Vietnam War, and after Logan learns that Sabretooth killed his girlfriend, Wolverine volunteers to get adamantium from Stryker to fight him, and then learns that Stryker and Sabretooth are working together to hunt and experiment on mutants. Logan fights Weapon 11, and Stryker takes Logan's memories. The X-Men make a cameo to save mutant kids. In X-Men 1, Wolverine meets the X-Men and helps them fight Magneto's reborn Brotherhood. That includes Wolverine's brother, Sabretooth. Jean uses Cerebro, forcing her powers to expand. X-Men 2, Wolverine and the X-Men go up against Wolverine's villain this time, Stryker, after he faked an attack on the President to make mutants hated, and he copies Cerebro to force a brainwashed Xavier to kill mutants. Jean's powers begin to go haywire, and she sacrifices herself to save the X-Men. What's left of the Brotherhood helps fight Stryker as their common enemy. In X-Men 3, Wolverine helps lead the X-Men against the Brotherhood as they gain an army to combat the new cure designed to turn mutants into humans. Jean returns from the dead with a split personality, the Phoenix, and joins the Brotherhood after learning Xavier manipulated her powers as a child, and she kills Xavier. Trask Industries returns, helping the military and Worthington Labs, the lab that creates the cure. The Wolverine. Wolverine is hiding away from the world, sad he had to kill Jean at the end of X-Men 3. And he's found by Yukio and brought to an old friend from World War II that he saved. His friend, Yashida, fakes his death, has Logan's powers stolen, and Yashida's encased in an adamantium suit of armor, and he goes by the Silver Samurai. Logan learns to be a hero again and defeats him, gaining the friendship of Yashida's granddaughter, Mariko. 2 years later, Trask Industries is making Sentinels as seen on TV, and Xavier returns from the dead with Magneto to recruit Logan to fight the Sentinels. And then in Days of Future, Sentinels have taken over the world, killing mutants and all humans who wish to help them. The last team of mutants fight to survive as Wolverine is sent back in time into his past body to stop Mystique from killing Trask and getting captured to create the Sentinels. Then they would form the X-Men sooner and convince humans that mutants are actually good. Though personally I think if you were to remove Days of Past and Days of Future from that list, it still makes perfect sense. You just get more context with Days of Future Past. Now, Days of Future Past has the job of bridging the gap between X-Men 3 and the Wolverine, and then bridging the gap between X-Men First Class and X-Men Origins, as well as creating threads of continuity throughout the other films. In some of my previous videos, I've already explained how Days of Future Past fixes some major continuity errors, such as Xavier being able to walk, or Beast being able to turn back and forth from blue and human. And I explained some continuity questions people had, like, for example, how Xavier's alive at the beginning of Days of Future Past when he died in X-Men 3. This brings me to the first continuity question a lot of people might have: the time between X-Men 3 and X-Men Days of Future Past. X-Men Last Stand seems to have a peaceful ending, with mutants being understood by the government and hope being in the air. And in the Wolverine, the world seems fairly peaceful while Wolverine's off doing his own thing in Japan. But then by Days of Future Past's intro, there's a war that's already started to ravage the world, with mutants and humans being exterminated. Consider this. In X-Men 3, the Phoenix had just disintegrated half the military, and that wouldn't be something that would just kind of go away just because she died. There would probably be a lot of underlying issues in the background that we're not seeing. However, X-Men 3 just covered what was going on with the mutants, not everyone else in the world. There's also the fact that the end of X-Men 3 and a little bit of Days of Future Past kind of hints that the cure in X-Men 3 wears off, because at the end of X-Men 3 we see Magneto's powers briefly starting to return, and then we see in Days of Future Past that Rogue has her powers again, despite the fact that she got rid of them in X-Men 3. If the thing that humans saw was suppressing mutants' powers is failing, that might cause some panic. And in a promotional thing for Days of Future Past, it suggested that Yashida's shrimp-looking robots that was used to steal Wolverine's powers was also in the running as a replacement cure. And when Wolverine defeated Yashida and that whole thing went under, I'm sure that added to some of the tension. And then 2 years later, we see Trask's Sentinels being advertised on TV, right around the time the war was probably about to start, when Xavier and Magneto came to recruit Wolverine to their cause. And that's another small thing I've heard some fans ask. At the end of the Wolverine, when Xavier and Magneto pick up Logan, the world seems somewhat intact, but then when they get to the Chinese temple at the beginning of Days of Future Past, the world's already destroyed. And people wonder how that even makes sense. And for some reason, they're taking it literal just because they're at an airport and then they get off an airplane in Days of Future Past. There's been time that's passed, from 2015 to 2023. It wasn't an instant trip. For some reason, people take that really literally, when it's meant to be two completely separate moments. It seems in X-Men 3 that Secretary Trask had access to Worthington Labs and the cure, and once the mutant's cure wears off, it's probable that they gave Trask Industries the green light to start using Sentinels. Now this brings me to the Boulevard Trask continuity error. One of the main issues in Days of Future Past continuity-wise are the two Trasks. In X-Men 3, Secretary Trask was played by Bill Dukes, but then when we learn about Trask being killed in 1973 by Mystique, Trask is played by Peter Dinklage. There's an obvious difference in their appearance, and while one of them is killed in 1973, the other one appears alive in the 2000s. The thing is, they never actually call Trask in X-Men 3 Boulevard Trask, it's Secretary Trask, and obviously two people can have the same last name. The Trask in 1973 could have been related to the Secretary Trask from X-Men 3.
You know who she's been imitating? Secretary Trask here.
Yes, sir.
As we see in X-Men 3, that Trask seems humiliated by Mystique posing as him. He also seems smug when they say that they've caught her finally. This is due to her killing his family member in 1973, the Boulevard Trask, played by Peter Dinklage. The Trask in 1973 was building Sentinels to kill mutants, and then after his death, they tortured Mystique to make the Sentinels of the future. But after the events of X-Men 1 and 2, the mutants found a way to bring peace with the President. Trask Industries still works on the Sentinels, but they're not finished yet. Charles said in 50 years they developed, so the time between X3 and the Wolverine, they were being perfected. I think it could also be an interesting character detail if Peter Dinklage and Bill Duke's characters are half-brothers. That could add a little more relevance to the line where he says,
Never before, in all of human history, has there been a cause which could unite us as a species. Until now.
When referring to the mutant problem. As an interracial family, that would probably hit home for him. That's not the only continuity error that seems to exist in Days of Future Past. The next continuity error that Days of Future Past seem to have caused is Logan's claws in Days of Future Past versus his claws in the Wolverine. Logan got his metal claws cut off in the Wolverine at the end, and his bone claws grew back in. Then in Days of Future Past, his metal claws are back. The director of the film did address this by saying that maybe Magneto put the metal back on his claws, but I think there are more details to it than just that. At the end of the Wolverine, Logan and Mariko, Yashida's granddaughter, are very close, and it seems like maybe they're starting to date. She owns Yashida's company, and as we find out in the Wolverine, Yashida collected all the adamantium around the world that he could find and stockpiled it to create his Silver Samurai suit, and there's probably some left over. So if Wolverine wanted more adamantium, he could just go to Mariko at the beginning of the war, and yes, Magneto can just use his powers and put them back on him. And they had from 2015 to 2023 to do that. And they simply could have just gotten it from the suit of the Silver Samurai or his old claws that were left over. It's not exactly a continuity error, it's just unexplained. The pieces are there, you just gotta think about it. And a lot of people are like, well, what would be the point of giving him his adamantium claws back for the war if we're only going to see them come out for 5 seconds and it's not even when he's fighting? You also have to consider the time period between the Wolverine and Days of Future Past. There's been a Sentinel War. For that part of the story, he would need adamantium claws. Not exactly for the story we see on the screen, but for that aspect, it would not make sense for him to have bone claws still. They would have found a way to get him his adamantium claws back to fight Sentinels. Even if we didn't see it on screen, it's that little detail in the universe that's necessary. Another continuity error would be the fact of Kitty's powers to push people back through time, when originally her power was just to walk through walls. Yes, it would have been nice to explain how she got those powers, but I guess it was probably due to screen time and how long it would take to explain that situation. Apparently, the writers of the movie said that it was a natural progression of her powers. So now instead of being able to walk through solid objects, she can walk through the fabric of time, or at least push people through the fabric of time into their past body. I feel like this could be called a continuity error if none of the characters acted like this was news, but some of the other characters are acknowledging that this is brand new. And as we see throughout the movie, humans had been experimenting on mutants during the Sentinel War like they were with Rogue. So it's not hard to believe that maybe they were experimenting on Kitty at one point before she escaped and joined these free mutants, and then she just discovers this brand new power. And I know it seems convenient that this character just happens to develop time travel powers so the movie can happen, but that's kind of what the point is. This mutant discovers something that can help their situation. Very much like an Endgame, Ant-Man just happens to discover time travel using the quantum technology. It's not like anyone was talking about time traveling first and then they just discovered this conveniently. This is what made them think, hey, let's time travel. And as Kitty and Bobby discuss at one point, there are limitations to her powers, which is why they probably didn't think, hey, let's go all the way back to the beginning and fix this. And then Logan's like, oh, I can survive that trip, and so they send Logan. And I think Wolverine being able to heal his mind for that trip is a little different than healing his mind after getting shot in the head by Stryker. One of them is instant destruction, and the other one is preparing for something that's slowly happening. Like Logan being hit with a bomb versus Logan being stretched. And then we've got Sunspot in Days of Future Past. We see him in 2023 helping fight the Sentinels. And in the new timeline, he is a new mutant. I've seen some people say this is a continuity error because of his age in the actor. And I'm mentioning this in the Days of Future Past video because I don't think New Mutants has enough continuity errors to justify its own video. I wouldn't call the Sunspot differences a continuity error, because it's just a recast. At the time that Days of Future Past came out, the actor for that character would have been 32, but during New Mutants, the actor playing Sunspot would be 23. And if New Mutants takes place in 2017 in the actual film timeline, it wouldn't be too hard to fudge the ages just a little bit. All you'd have to say is one's a younger version of the character and the other one's the older version of the character. Not only that, but Sunspot from Days of Future Past is in one timeline, whereas Sunspot from New Mutants is in the second timeline. Because of what Logan did in 1973, Sunspot could have been born at a different time. Which is ironic because he's the one in Days of Future Past who expressed the worry that some of them might not even be born if they go back and change the timeline. So since it's just a recast and Sunspot could have been born at a different time period due to time travel changes, this isn't a continuity error. There's also the irony he died working alongside Colossus in Days of Future Past, and then in the new timeline ends up with Colossus' sister in New Mutants. Now as far as the past part of the story, it does a lot of weaving continuity together while having a handful of continuity errors itself. As I mentioned, X-Men First Class left off with the X-Men being established and the Brotherhood being established, with the military learning about mutants and the CIA knowing about them as well, with Agent Stryker on their team and Moira McTaggart being memory wiped from knowing what happened to the X-Men at the end of the movie. Not only do we learn that Magneto's whole team died, with the exception of him and Mystique, with autopsy photos of Azazel and Angel being shown, and Magneto yelling to Charles that Azazel, Angel, and Emma were all killed, we also hear that Banshee might have been killed.
Angel, Azazel, Emma, Banshee, mutant brothers and sisters, all dead!
And no one gives a shit about Riptide! And if you know a lot of the Easter eggs put into the X-Men films, you'd know that in X-Men Origins, we already saw a version of Banshee alive and well in Stryker's captivity. While that Easter egg takes place in 1979, Banshee's said to have died before 1973. If we were to consider that that was Banshee in X-Men Origins, that continuity error could be rectified by the fact that the X-Men and Magneto thought Banshee was killed, but really his death was faked, or he was just hauled away without their notice, and then he was put in the same facility as Emma Silverfox and all these other mutants on 3 Mile Island. And then once Charles saves him, he finds out, oh, you're not dead. We never see Banshee die on screen, and we never see his autopsy photo, so we could always say that Eric just thought Banshee died. His DNA would be later used for the Sentinels like Mystique's powers. That's why they wail when they fly. And we might not ever see Banshee after X-Men Origins in the timeline, but we do see his daughter in X-Men 2 and 3. And she's from the comics, Siren. And I like the detail they added with Mystique crying when she sees Azazel's autopsy photo, setting up the possibility that maybe her and Azazel had a kid, which would be Nightcrawler in X-Men Apocalypse. But I'll get to that later. Not only was Magneto's whole team basically killed, except for him and Mystique, but then Magneto ends up going to prison for killing JFK in 1963. One of the things Logan's supposed to do when he gets back to 1973 is to free Magneto from prison so that he and Charles could be back together at a time where they couldn't have been farther apart. And that raised the question, how did Magneto get out of prison in the first timeline? If he was arrested for killing the president, why is he out and about in X-Men 1, 2, and 3? And even the flashback in X-Men 3 where he's with Charles going to enlist Jean into the school. Well, that's the thing. If Xavier could free Magneto from prison in the new timeline, it's possible Xavier freed him from prison in the original timeline, but probably in a way that didn't break the law. Maybe Xavier thought that if Magneto and him united after finding out that the humans were working on Sentinels to destroy mutants, they could find a way to bring peace between humans and mutants while having peace between mutants and mutants. Especially after everything that happened in Cuba, maybe that's when Xavier wanted to try to bury the hatchet to try to form a strong team so that the mutants could be united in their fight for freedom. But as we see in X-Men 1, that doesn't really last long. This time, Logan would free Magneto from prison before Mystique's DNA was taken by Trask Industries and Stryker, not after. As far as the X-Men side of this story, I said in my last video that Charles was depressed and hiding from the world, and Beast was helping him. The movie uses the failed mutant cure from X-Men First Class to explain why Beast can jump back and forth from being blue and being human. He also made a version of the cure that would heal Charles' spine so he could walk. Xavier tried to start a school that failed because of the Vietnam War, which is where Havoc went. He ended up being taken by Stryker for his mutant team that included Ink, Toad, and Daniels. A continuity error here would be Toad's age. The actor was 30 during Days, and Ray Park, the actor from X-Men 1, was 23 during X-Men 1. But they don't have to be playing characters their age. Since Toad's mutation in Days of Future Past distorts his face, we could say he was 18 around that time. And if X-Men 1 were in 1994, like my timeline video suggests, he would be in his 30s by X-Men 1, so that could work if we look at it like that. Just adjust some of the ages. And as far as Toad's physical appearance changing between Days of Future Past, X-Men Origins, and X-Men 1, consider the fact that in Days of Future Past, Toad is a lot younger, and then in X-Men Origins, he had been tortured and experimented on. And then in X-Men 1, his skin complexion changed because maybe he's gotten older and because of temperature and stress, apparently Toad's changed color, but also he just dyed his hair green, for a theme. Really, their look isn't that drastically different, especially between Days of Future Past and X-Men Origins. We could look at it like this for the Stryker age issue too. Okay, so Brian Cox, Stryker from X-Men 2, is 76 years old, which means he was 56 when X2 came out. If my timeline video theory is correct, and X2 is in 1994, because X-Men Origins is in 1979 and it was 15 years between Logan losing his memories and Logan meeting the X-Men, that would make Stryker 41 in X-Men Origins. 6 years before that was the Vietnam War, when Stryker met Wolverine, and when the Paris Peace Accord situation takes place, which would make Stryker in 1973 35. So if the actor of Stryker was 56 in X-Men 2, and if the actor of Stryker in X-Men Origins was 46, pretty damn close to 41, and Stryker in Days of Future Past is 35, I think the guy who played a Stryker in Days of Future Past, Josh Hillman, could pull off 35 since he was 28. Consider Xavier was played by a man in his 30s, and he was supposed to be 41 in Days. We could use the same logic with Stryker. I think Danny Huston would have been too old to reprise that role in Days of Future Past and be believable, so they needed a recast. It wouldn't have to be a literal translation, since in 1979 Xavier looked like a de-aged Patrick Stewart instead of James McAvoy. We don't need a literal reason for their faces to change so drastically, it's just a recast situation. So technically, these two versions of the character are the same version of the character. It's just that in X-Men Origins, they had Danny Huston play both 1973 Stryker and 1979 Stryker. Then in Days of Future Past, they recast the 1973 Stryker. I explained in my last video why Raven and Xavier have a brother-sister relationship in First Class and Days of Future Past, but not in the original X-Men trilogy. And I've realized in that video that Xavier and Raven don't even share screen time in the original trilogy. But then I also realized there is one moment that they actually share screen time, and it's in X-Men 2 when Raven shows up to tell Jason in the form of Stryker to have Xavier kill all humans. And then Raven turns around with Magneto and leaves Xavier to die with Jason. In a way, that actually continues my explanation in the last video about why Raven and Xavier don't seem to care about each other in the original trilogy. I mentioned that after Stryker captures Mystique, Charles still helps Stryker try to cure his son and help him with his mutations, and Raven got insulted by this. And the one time we actually see them together in the original trilogy, she's leaving Xavier to die with Jason. So to me, that kind of helps solidify my reason as to why their relationship as brother and sister makes sense throughout the whole story. Days now makes it so this line from X-Men 2 could mean either Logan or Mystique.
The one thing I know better than anyone is my own work.
Step away!
In my First Class video, I talked a little bit about how Mystique escaped Stryker's captivity between the events of X-Men Days of Past and X-Men 1, and I came to the conclusion that since Charles, Eric, Beast, and Logan were all preoccupied in the original timeline, it was probably Havoc, Toad, Inc., and Daniels that saved her, because she saved them from Stryker. I said this is how Toad probably ended up back in captivity in X-Men Origins. And just for fun, we could say that Gambit escaped when they saved Mystique. And right after she got saved by them, they probably went to Xavier and explained the situation and Raven's torture. And this is what got him back on his feet, so to speak. As well as why he has Sentinel designs in the Danger Room in X-Men 3, just in case the Sentinels ever get finished and put to use. Another thing I want to clarify, just in case anyone hasn't seen my other X-Men videos, the fact that Mystique even killed Trask at the Paris Peace Accords in the first place could be why Wolverine's in Vietnam in X-Men Origins. A murder at the Peace Accords could have extended the war for a brief amount of time, thus causing Wolverine and his brother to be put back into the war, and therefore meet Stryker. This could explain why Logan's in New York in Days of Future Past instead of Vietnam. He hasn't been sent yet. Now there's one more detail to this whole thing. Havoc's connection to Stryker in Days of Future Past can explain why Stryker goes after Scott in X-Men Origins. Havoc took his main subject to make the Sentinels by freeing Mystique. In Origins, we know Victor and Stryker are hunting down the old members of Stryker's team, and Havoc was from one of the teams before Logan's team. Scott is the bait, and while providing Stryker with the mutation to add to the Deadpool, Weapon 11. That would be why Xavier knew to find Scott and save him and the other mutants in X-Men Origins. Havoc went to him and said that his brother was captured. And with Mystique being freed from Stryker's captivity, that would probably put a delay on the Sentinel program, causing Stryker to want to create a whole new program, such as the Weapon X program and Weapon 11. Timeline-wise, he would have had Havoc's team first, and then when they were freed by Mystique, he would then later, after capturing Mystique, form the team that Logan was a part of. And then after 6 years, he would start hunting down those members of the old team and using their DNA to create Weapon 11. And I know a lot of people don't like the character Weapon 11, but if you think about it, he could be more connected to this whole Mystique situation than we thought. The research and DNA from Weapon 11 could have gone into the design of the Sentinels. Think about it. Weapon 11 had Wade's katanas in his arms as stabbing weapons. The Sentinels could turn their hands into stabbing weapons. Weapon 11 had laser eyes from Cyclops. The Sentinels had laser eyes. Weapon 11 could heal. We see the Sentinels have some sort of ability to heal. And Weapon 11 has adamantium on his skeleton to see if the body could take a skeleton of metal. If you were to take Weapon 11's DNA and mix it with Mystique's, so instead of having Weapon 11's problem where only specific DNA can connect to it so it doesn't tear itself apart, the DNA from Mystique can adapt to any mutation, allowing it to be put into the body, plus making the body be able to create the blades instead of having katana blades come out of hands, and then replace the adamantium skeleton with an upgraded Sentinel, thus explaining why they made a hybrid of organic and robotic to create the Sentinels. And with Mystique's DNA, the body can adjust to the size of the Sentinel skeleton, making them taller versions of Weapon 11. And the reason they need Rogue's DNA later on is so that not only will the Sentinels be able to adapt to mutations, but they can steal the mutations on the fly with Rogue's powers. And if I had to guess why they'd get rid of Wraith's powers so that Sentinels can't teleport, it'd be because every time he teleported, his skeleton would be exposed, therefore making the core of the Sentinels vulnerable. In an attempt to make Weapon 11's arm blades seem less stupid, think of it this way. Stryker used his son's DNA to control Deadpool, and used Bradley's DNA so he could use a computer to do it. If Deadpool has Jason's DNA in him, which is illusion powers, we could simply be seeing Deadpool using those powers to make people think he's ejecting the blades from his hands, but in reality, he's just using Wade's katanas. He's just trying to be intimidating. So the blades aren't actually unrealistically coming out of his arms in a cartoony way. He's just using Jason's illusion powers to make us think so. And to make him seem more like Deadpool, the end credits scene has him saying shh to us, like he's seeing us because of Jason's illusion powers, so he's still projecting the blades as going back into his fist because he knows we're watching him, so to speak, or at least he thinks we are because of the illusions he's seeing of breaking the fourth wall. And let's say for the sake of argument, Stryker did find a way to get the blades to be able to fit in Wade's arms and or torso altogether when they're not being used. Stryker wouldn't give a crap what Wade could do when he's not being used. He's a weapon, he doesn't care about his comfort. So if the blades do somehow fit in the arms, he doesn't care if he can bend them when he's not on duty. He's a weapon, he's not a person to him. I think a lot of these explanations and details tie together the original X-Men timeline pretty well, and could make it make a lot more sense. And once it all leads to the apocalyptic future, Days of Future, and Wolverine is sent back in time to 1973 to stop all of this from happening, he breaks Magneto out of prison with the help of a friend of his, Quicksilver, which I believe is also tied to X-Men Origins. In X-Men Origins, when Wolverine helps free all these mutants from Stryker's complex, we see one mutant that's tied up to the ceiling and strapped in place so when he tries to use his speed powers, it keeps him in one spot. I believe after Wolverine saves all these mutants and then loses his memory from Stryker, it's possible in the next 15 years, Quicksilver maybe runs into him and thanks him for saving him, and then they become friends. Maybe in the original timeline, they didn't know that Quicksilver was Magneto's son, because it's never brought up. I know I've dismissed that excuse in a lot of my videos, including my Fast and Furious 9 video, but I feel like if they're breaking Magneto out of prison, that's an important detail to bring up. Plus, he never worked for or against Magneto in the original trilogy, so yeah. Once Logan, Charles, and Beast change the timeline, stopping Mystique from killing Trask and ending the creation of Sentinels, the mutants fighting for freedom in the future get rewritten in a future that's happy and bright. Wolverine wakes up in the future, seeing everybody's alive again, and all the details I've explained in these videos have been erased. This opens up for new events to take place in the new timeline. Though unfortunately, even though the timeline's been restarted, there are still continuity errors down the road, and I might argue they're even bigger ones than the original timeline. Especially since just because the original timeline was deleted doesn't make it non-canon. The next X-Men continuity in the new timeline I'll discuss is X-Men Apocalypse, a movie I personally think is underrated.